So what we're going to do is we we make sure Maya is closed. We open up the Maya folder on the D drive. I'll volume down. Open up the but click on the 2014 and we delete it. Okay, so we're deleting the old Maya preferences, and then we're going to go back to the Documents folder, back to our folder, back to the 2540 or wherever you put your 2014 folder, and then we have to copy it. So make sure that we right-click and copy this, or Control-drag to copy it in there and not actually move it. If you move it, then you're not going to have that old backup in there. Okay? And remember to do that every day you come in, because if someone in the previous class has deleted preferences, you're going to have a different set of preferences and things just aren't going to work correctly for you. All right, so then we can open up Maya by typing in Maya 2014. And there we go. Now I'll wait for it to open. We should have in here, if I go to File Recent Projects, I should still be under the Sarcona Playing Around project. So I know that I'm still under the same area up with the background, the Playing Around Sarcona, whatever your name is, project, which is fine. We're still playing around. We're not actually ready to begin our first one. When we get to that first one, it's going to be everything we've done as a review. Okay, it's basically putting it together and actually creating something that looks like a nice piece, rendering it out, and making it look fancy. All right, we'll probably start that one on Wednesday, or maybe even today we'll get a chance to do it. All right, so again, we're going to start off with the sphere. Like I said before, I like to start off with a NURB sphere, but realistically, the polygon's going to do pretty much the same thing. So I have a NURB sphere. Again, I'm setting it on the ground because I like it to be on the ground. And the way I set it on the ground is basically I take whatever my radius is here for the NURBs and put it on the ground at 1. So my radius is 1, so that's going to be 1. If for whatever reason my radius was 2, that would be 2. Okay, so it's sitting on the ground. I want to freeze my transforms on here so I get rid of this translate Y. So I go up to our button that says Freeze Transforms, and I click it. Yes, ma'am. All I did was to move it onto the ground. You just take the Translate Y, and you move it up to 1. That's it. And then we hit Freeze Transform, and then we hit Delete History. Okay? Yes, sir. Okay, so now here we are. So we're going to set this thing up. We're going to come down before we set any keys and just make sure that our settings are the same as they were before. If you look at my timeline here, and I get my head out of the way, I'm set up to 1 on the left side, and then over here I'm set up to 24 and 48. So obviously my time is not at 30 frames per second, which is what we want it to be.
Can you redo that 24 and 48? What are those two boxes again?
This one here is your work area. Okay. The inner ones is your work area. The outer ones is just the entire timeline. Okay. So if I'm working on a 1,000 frame animation and I want to focus on the middle 500, I can just focus in on those middle 500. So I'm going to go next to my key to the animation preferences. I'm going to go to my settings, and I'm going to verify that my time is set to 30 frames per second. Then under my time slider, I just want to make sure that it's still set to play every frame, real time 30 frames per second. Okay, and then that's good. So hit save. You'll see that my time slider is at 1 and 1.25, so I'm just going to reset both of these to 1. And then I'm going to reset this one to 60. And then I'm going to rewind it. Okay, so I'm at frame 1. Both are 1, both are 60. Okay, so now we're going to do the ball bouncing, just like we did before. So if you remember from last time, we set it up so that all we have to do, yes ma'am. Okay, so you remember from last time we set it up so all we have to do is be clicked on the actual value, like translate Y, And then we can hit the S key, and that'll set a key. Okay? And if you remember from last time also, instead of us going through and saying at frame 1 the ball's here, at frame 10 it's here, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and so on, what we can do is go through and set all the low points, then come back and set all the high points. So that's what we're going to do. We're at frame 1. We're clicked on Translate Y. We can hit, oops, I guess we didn't set that up. We can't hit S. I don't know why I thought we set that up already. So we're going to just right click on Translate Y and go to Key Selected. And then go to frame 20, right click, Key Selected. Go to frame 40, right click, Key Selected. Go to frame 60, right click, Key Selected. Okay, so we have a keyframe at 1, 20, 40, and 60 with the ball on the ground. Okay. Once you're good there, then we can go to frame 10 and scoot the ball up to some value like, I don't know, in mine, I think 7 probably looks like a good number. And then I'm going to key it. Okay. And then in order for me to set the key at 30, I'm not going to left click in the timeline. I'm going to middle click in the timeline and then just reset that key at 7, go to 50, set it to 7. Okay, so now we have a ball bouncing, and it's not too terribly fantastic like we had before. Alright, so what's one thing we can do to make the ball's impact in the ground look a little bit better? What was that?
Scale it, squash it, stretch it.
Before we even get into that stuff.
Each time it bounces, it goes up less.
That's one thing it's going to do. But what about when it actually hits the ground?
More linear.
More linear. There we go. That's what we're looking for. So when it hits the ground, if we look at this, you can see that the ball is actually slowing down before it hits the ground. Okay? And speeding up on the way. It's speeding up on the way up, no problem. But it shouldn't be slowing down before it hits the ground. So we need to click on our graph editor. And then now here's where the actual magic happens. We hit F to frame the graph editor. We have these graphs on the bottom. So we're going to make them linear, just like we said. So we click the linear button. There we go. Okay. So now if we were to hit play, it's going to look like the ball is actually having some sort of impact with the ground. That it's hitting the ground and then coming back up. Okay? That was one thing we can do. The other thing was, like we said, lower the hills so that the first hill is a little bit lower, the second hill is a little bit lower. So let's do that as well. So let's take the hill, and then we hold Shift. We're in the Move tool, middle mouse button, drag it down. Grab the next hill, hold Shift, middle mouse button, drag it down. So we're going to take the other hills and just make them a little bit narrower. All right, another thing we can do to this is if we look at the way that these graphs are lined up, is it looks like it's basically like a constant acceleration and deceleration, and then they kind of slow down at the top, okay? So it's basically like a constant speed, constant speed, constant speed, and then around here-ish, we start to slow down, okay? And then here we do the same thing and it picks up. You don't have a constant acceleration when you're falling. As you fall, the further you fall, the faster you're going to go, okay? So I'm going to exaggerate this, but instead of this graph looking like this, it should actually kind of look more like that, okay? I'm exaggerating, like I said, but that's kind of how it should look. So I'm going to move these so that we have that. Now on the way up, it's going to be a different story than on the way down. On the way up, we should have basically a constant acceleration at the beginning, or not a constant, but a quicker on the beginning and then slow down. So we are going to go like that. On the way down, we're going to go basically like that too. Remember, we can't adjust these handlebars on the inside without breaking them first. So I need to marquee them and then click this icon up here that says break tangents. And now I can manipulate these individually. Okay, so now these are just becoming more hilly, becoming more apparent about what's happening. A little bit more acceleration is being introduced into the mix.
How are you adding keys like that? Because it wouldn't add keys for me.
You have to use the middle mouse. So I click on the insert tool, highlight it to tell it this is the graph that I'm adding stuff to, and then it's just a matter of middle clicking. And then keep those same things that we already talked about in line. The hills should be smaller, they should be narrower, we should have the same kind of linearness on the bottom. And another thing that I'm doing is I'm kind of nudging my middle keyframe. Instead of having a perfect split from, let's say, 1 to 20 and 10 is the high point, I'm moving it back a frame so that it goes quicker up, hangs out at the top a little bit longer, and then comes back down. Okay? So instead of this middle keyframe being at 10, I moved it down to 9. I moved this one back a frame, this one back a frame, this one back a frame. Okay, just so it kind of goes quicker higher up. If we're animating this as a final piece, we would have stuff like motion blur in the scene. And that motion blur would help kind of sell the idea that this ball has a little bit of motion to it, a little bit of movement to it. One of the things that we can preview inside here is motion blur. Okay, and that might sound like a weird thing, but you can actually preview motion blur inside of your viewport. Under the renderer, there's a viewport 2.0. So right here, viewport 2.0, we can turn this option box on, and then we can turn on motion blur. And I switch to it, and then there's the options. So now when I hit play, I can adjust this. It's not full-blown motion blur. There is some fudginess to it. It doesn't look perfect, but you couldn't get real motion blur in here, okay? But just so you see, it's kind of there, but you really don't have to worry about it too much because there would be some sort of motion blur on there. It's under renderer viewport 2.0, under this here. This, right here. See in your viewport? Right there. And then you go to the option box by going there. Okay, so just so you can see, we are going to put motion blur on our final ones, just not on this one yet. One of the reasons that that one doesn't work too good is because it's blurring both sides of it. It's blurring the front and it's blurring the back of it. Realistically, it wouldn't do that. We would have basically the blur behind it, right? So, like I said, we would have other stuff on here. All right, so let's get this thing moving. It's kind of boring just sitting in this one spot. Let's actually get it moving along something. So if I go in here and I reset this back to the beginning, okay, so I reset this back to frame 1. I'm moving this back in the X direction to -12. It doesn't have to be perfectly -12, but because I like to be organized and -12 is a nice round number, I'm going to keep it at -12. I'm going to set a key in the translate X at frame 1. I'm going to go up to frame 56 or 60, whatever my last frame is. I'm going to set it to +12 and then set another key. So now if I rewind and play, you'll see that I'm getting that movement of the ball going across it. We fixed this in the graph editor. So if we go to the graph editor, we can look at this and frame it, and we can see exactly why we're getting that kind of movement. Okay? Remember what I said last time. If we have a more horizontal line than vertical, that means that we're not going to get a lot of movement. Okay? If we get a very vertical line, we're going to get a lot of movement. So from here to about where this red line is, or about there, I'll even zoom in. What kind of line, if you were just to kind of pick either vertical or horizontal, would you say that this line is right here? Horizontal, right. So we're not getting a lot of movement. And then after this, we kind of pick up, and then we're not totally vertical, but we're obviously more horizontal or more vertical than we were before. So this is slowing down at the beginning, speeding up in the middle, and then slowing down at the end. Okay? That's our default tangent. So if we do one simple thing by clicking linear here, we'll get a constant acceleration. Okay? It'll move at a constant speed on this. So now if we rewind this and play it, you'll see how we get a constant speed. And we don't get that weird thing. We get a nice little bump right there. Now we could go into more. So if we were to look at some more of the reference for this, we would probably see that from an actual ball bouncing, the first hill to the second hill would actually move so much. The second hill to the third hill would move less. The third hill to the fourth would move less. We don't need to get into that much detail in this kind of assignment, but if you're trying to do something that's super realistic, you want to get the reference and you want to do that kind of thing. So just to show you, you don't do this, but just to show you what this might look like, I'm going to add in some extra keyframes here. And I'm basically going to wherever the ball hits. That. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tweak these. Like that. Okay, and I'll make this all linear. Okay, so something like that. So that gives us the appearance that the first bounce, we have a lot of movement. The second bounce, not as much. The third bounce, not as much. And the fourth and fifth bounce, not as much. If I have fourth and fifth, yes I do. Okay, so that gives us more of a realistic look into what this ball should be doing just by kind of figuring out what the math or what the physical movement is and then trying to apply that in 3D. Okay, now this graph, I could actually simplify it. I could actually get rid of lots of this stuff, make this part flat, make this one like that, and I'd probably basically have the same thing. Maybe a little bit more movement on the end. Probably made this a little bit too flat. Okay, so it's basically the same exact thing. It's just in one I had the points there, and the other one I didn't have the points. In one I had a little bit more control, and another one I didn't. Okay, so a lot of times you have to decide whether or not you're going to need points in there. It's very easy at the beginning of this to say, okay, well I want the ball at this point to be a little bit higher, a little bit longer. So I key it, and now you see how this is kind of flattening out. So I need to debate, internally whether or not I keep this keyframe or if I just try to achieve the same thing by just manipulating the graph. Okay? So essentially we're looking at the graph. We're not looking at individual values for it. Now there is, like I talked about before, let me duplicate this thing just so we can see it. Come on. All right, I could get rid of all of these, and you see that with the exception of these end two here, this one and that one, I basically have the same kind of graph, but I don't have as much control over this graph because of that. Okay? If I wanted to make this go higher, I have to grab this, grab the handle, and basically like mess with it this way in order for me to get the ball to go higher. And it's not realistic. Okay? When you're creating a graph and you're manipulating the points and trying to figure out which points to keep and which ones to get rid of, you should look at it. Obviously, you're going to look at it from your own way per assignment. But one of the things that I've kind of had a good rule of that is don't let your graph exceed your keyframes. Okay? Meaning that I wouldn't want point here and then to grab this and go like that, because I've exceeded where my keyframe value was. If I want a keyframe way up here, I should keyframe it way up there and then deal with those in-between marks, okay? So my graph, this is as high as it goes, that's where I want to keep it, okay? And the reason for that is, let's say I got a new direction from the director that says, instead of that wall being 7 feet high, it's now going to be 6 feet. So I can very quickly just grab that and say, okay, well, the highest the ball is going to bounce is 6 feet. And I click it, and now it's pushed down a little bit, and now we're good. The other way, I don't really even know how high this is going. Okay, I see that it's between 10 and 8, so maybe it's like 9 point, well, if I look over here, 9.45, but I can't manually do that without messing with this graph, which messes with these other graphs. All right, so your rule of where you put keyframes is at the extensions, at the limits of these things. We can add stuff in the middle of these, but you just have to be careful with it. Now another little trick, because these are just little tricks you kind of pick up, is if we added 2 keyframes here and had this ball sitting on the ground, it makes it look like the ball's hitting the ground a little bit better, okay? If we think of this, we're only on the ground for 1 frame, okay? Your mind really can't process 1 frame of 30 frames a second very good. So if we give 2 frames, that kind of reinforces it in our brain that, okay, this ball is hitting the ground. Sometimes if you watch stuff that's not properly done, you'll see that the ball is here, and then all of a sudden it's moving up before it's even hit the ground, okay? Because it just kind of, your brain just like skipped that little step. So right now we're going to go, now we have a good little animation. We're going to go at frame 19 or 21, doesn't matter, I go to the frame before, and then we're just going to add another keyframe. So I'm just going to go to my Translate Y, reset it to 0, and then set a key. Okay, so I'm just going to go to every one of the bounces before it bounces and reset it to 0. And then set another key. Yep. So I'm going to just come back to these and just make sure that these things are set back to linear when it hits the ground. Now, because we're moving forward in the X direction, our bounce is stopping for an extra frame. Realistically, this motion here of it moving along the X direction should also stop for an extra frame, because you can see as it's on the ground, it's still like sliding, okay? So the point of this is that these things can get very intense. You can get very deep into how this animation is. The goal of any animation assignment is to figure out how clear that message needs to be. Sometimes it's going to be very simple, like we did the first time, just a couple bounces and we're done. Sometimes it's going to be setting up the X keyframe, setting up the Z keyframe, setting up the Y, setting up all this other stuff, okay? So I'm going to do the X just so you can see it, but you don't need to do this, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to frame 19 with my left mouse button. I'm going to click on frame 20 with my right mouse button and then set a key in the X. And you see that sets a key here. And then I'm going to make sure I also set a key on the other side, okay? So it goes there and stops. Oops. And you lost my screen. Okay, so then we're going to go here again. Oops. Let me make sure this is still set to linear. Then we're going to go to the next stop right here. I'm going to set a key, middle click, set another key. Make sure it's linear again. Don't worry about doing this part, I just want you to see it.
But how are you setting them?
I'm just right clicking on Transit X right here. And then going to the middle click, keying. And I'm making sure it's linear every time, just because it keeps flattening itself out. I'm gonna get some weird wobbly movements if I do that. There we go. So now my graph has changed. I also had that little arch already in there. So now I have these steps in here. And if at any point in here I realize I want this to move a little bit further or a little bit less, I can do that. Like, I'm not really happy with how much this is moving. I want this to move maybe a little bit more. That's a little bit better. Okay, it still needs some work. It's not perfect. Now when we do the rotation, which is the next step, we should, if we are doing this correctly, should also go through and do this the same kind of way for each one of those. Okay, so you just have to keep these things in mind, that when you edit one thing, that might change the dynamic of the entire animation as well. Okay, so yours aren't going to have this, but mine does, just so you can see it. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is add some rotation in here. I found with this one, excuse me, it's very easy to add an animation or add a rotation to this. If we keep in mind the next step we're going to do after the rotation, which is adding some squashiness to this. Okay, and what I mean by that is if I were to rotate this arbitrarily, like so. And the rotation is going to be basically the same thing that we did on the other one. Set a key, move forward, rotate it a little bit, set another key. Okay? So now if I rewind this and play it, go kind of like that. I'm going to fix the graph. So again, we have basically a linear here and then a flattening out here. So it goes a bit quicker at the start of this because we're moving more, and then it goes into this slowing down. Okay, maybe it slows down a little bit too much. Let me just adjust it and adjust this a little bit. There we go. Okay, so it's something like this. So let's say I want to take this now and I wanted to squish the ball. To get out. So what I'm going to do is if I go to where the ball should be squished here and I look at this, I can't really get a good squash on this ball. Okay, the squash, by the way, is not simply just kind of scaling the ball down. The squash is flattening the ball in this direction and then scaling it up in the other two directions. That should be how the squash ends up looking. Okay, and if we are really trying to get accurate with this, there should be more weight in the scale on the bottom than there is on the top. But we're not going to worry about that. Okay, so this doesn't give me a really good perspective as to how I can get a good rotation on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to rotate this in increments that make sense to it. So basically, I'm going to flip it over. Every time it comes over, it's going to rotate 180 degrees. All right. So right here at this point, we'll do this part together just so we can see it. All right. So we're going to go back to frame 1, and we're going to set a keyframe on the rotate Z. Key selected. Okay. So make sure you have your first key selected at frame 1. Rotate Z is at 0. Then we're going to go up until we hit the first hill, or the first hit. Okay. So we have two keyframes there. So we want to make sure we do this for the one, and we'll adjust it after for the other. So when it hits, this thing should be rotated around 180 degrees. Keep in mind which direction it should be going, okay? Because it shouldn't be rotating backwards. That doesn't make sense. It should be rotating kind of with the movement of the ball. So it should be rotating this way, right? Now, if we would just typed in 180, you'll see that from mine's actually negative 180. So we want to make sure we type in negative 180 and then key that. And then as long as we're here, let's go up to the next frame and just set another 180. Okay, so we have two keyframes at negative 180. Mine are at 18 or 19 and 20. Yours might be at 15 and 16. All right, so then we're going to go up to the next bounce where it hits the ground and put in negative 360. Key that, go up a frame, key it again. And then we're going to do the same thing for the next one. So it's negative 360 minus 180. 540, good job. Negative 540. There we go. Okay, now we're not going to do it for the last two bounces. Okay? We can do something for the last two bounces, but we don't need to do a full 180 because it doesn't make sense. Realistically, even this thing kind of bouncing around like this is, it might be a little bit too much for the last bounce especially. All right? The last two bounces that we have are just going to be random movements. So we're just going to go to the end of this and just figure out maybe for those last two bounces it does a full rotation. Okay? Or finishes the rotation. So negative 720. All right, so first bounce happens, 180. Second bounce, another 180. Second bounce, another 180. And then the last two bounces is 180 combined. Okay? So our graph for the rotate Z is going to look like this, but again, we have to worry about what the actual graph is going to look like. Okay? This is the default graph. We have to make it look like what should be happening to our ball at this time. Let me see if this works. It didn't work the other day. Nope, can't do it. That's right. I forgot I can't do it with that now. All right. So now let's look at this and think about what's happening in each pass. So here, the ball is starting its movement. Okay, it's starting to move. It's starting to bounce. What should we have there? Was that? Linear, right. We could do linear. Okay. There's no problem with it, except for the fact that the ball is just going to start spinning really quick all of a sudden. Okay, which is bouncing all of a sudden. So we can try linear there. I think we might be better off leaving this as flat and just see what happens there. For the next one, when it hits the ground, this should definitely be linear, okay? Because again, it doesn't know that it's going to hit the ground. So it should just be kind of spinning and then all of a sudden, boom, it stops, all right? So let's make that linear, okay? So I'm gonna grab this one and make it linear. Oops. There we go, okay? Now let's see, this one we can probably leave, we can try to leave that as linear also. And actually the rest of these, except for the very last one, let's just leave them as linear and just see what it looks like. Okay, so I have my first one as a ease in or a flat. The bottom one as an ease out or flat. And then everything else in the middle is linear. Okay, so we'll see what that looks like. All right, that doesn't look bad. I like the way that looks. So I think that's pretty good. Just for fun, we'll make it linear and just see what all of it looks like. Yeah, and because of this, it's such a quick movement, I really don't notice a huge difference between either one. There's a little bit of a pause there on the rotation. Yeah, actually linear I think I do like better. All right, so we'll leave it at linear. And that's the cool thing about this too, is that we can just play with these things and just see how it looks. okay? Okay, now obviously this animation is going to be a bit different if we had this also going in the Z direction too, and we had that kind of movement. We would be rotated different. We'd have a different whole setup, okay? So sometimes you may even have something like this where you kind of set up just this kind of basic animation going like this, and then I do something like group it, and then I rotate it, and now this whole thing is set up to go in that diagonal direction, okay? Or if I have this thing bouncing down a hill, even though the dynamics wouldn't be the same, I could angle this, and that doesn't work totally, but it kind of works. Okay, but I can kind of reuse this same animation over and over and over again for different things. All right, yes, sir.
And you can move that stuff around until you key once in that rotate field, right? You know what I'm saying? At that point, then it changes it.
Right, like if I was to keyframe this thing moving from here to here or something, that obviously wouldn't work.
Yeah. So then, okay.
Right, so this is just basically kind of like placement, you know, where I have something. So if I have this on this mountain up here, I can set it up and move it here, and that whole animation will play out up there, okay? So you can, like I said, reuse this kind of stuff depending on where you want to move it to, okay? Even for a character, if you have a character animation and the character's fighting, it's no big deal just to take that animation and group it or whatever and move it to a different location. That's why a lot of times in some of the pre-viz houses or post-viz houses, or you know, where they're doing just visualization stuff, they'll just get motion capture data, apply it to a character, and put him wherever they need to put him. All right. So don't be afraid to experiment with this stuff. It's always best to have your loophole to get out of it. So always make sure you save your work. So I'm going to save this scene just so I have it. You should save your scene too. I'm going to call it BouncingBall 2 V02. Okay, and then we're going to add one more thing to this, which is going to be the squashing and stretching. All right, so we're going to add that squashing here. We're going to ignore the first one for this assignment. When you do your actual assignment, you will add in that squash, okay, at the beginning before he launches up. All right, so what we're going to do is we're at this frame. So I'm going to come up to frame 2, and I'm going to stretch him out, okay? Remember, I'm not going to simply go, okay, he's stretched out. Because what this gives him is this gives him more volume than he currently had, okay? The same way that if I went like this would take away volume that he had. I'm imagining that this is a bouncing ball. And when we take a bouncing ball and we push it onto the ground, it doesn't just move down. It pushes it down and stretches that way, but then the sides also come out, right? So we have to stretch him out like this, and then we have to scale him in the blue and the red direction. Don't take the hard way with this. The easy way is if we hold the control key and we grab on the one we don't want to move, the Y direction, you can see how it stretches that out or in, okay? And it's doing both at the same time. So I'm just going to kind of estimate as to how much he needs to move. So I'm going to do that again. So I'm at frame 2. I'm going to stretch him out a little bit here. I'm going to hold the control key and drag that manipulator down. And then I'm going to set keys for the scale. The shortcut key to set keys for all 3 scales at the same time is Shift R. Okay? So set your first keyframe, and you can see what my values are here. I can even round these just so it's easier. 0.7, 0.7, or 0.7, 1.5, and 0.7 are my 3 values. All right, so we're going to go to the peak of the hill. And where's the peak of the hill? Well, we should have a keyframe for it right here. This spot right here in my timeline should be the peak of my hill. Remember, we don't keyframe, or we don't not keyframe the peaks of our hills, okay? So right here at 9, this should be set back to not zeros, but 1s. Okay, so I just reset all my scales to 1s, and then hit Shift R again. And then we can preview that to see what it looks like. and we're going to set up the other ones. So we're going to go down to here. Now I can't go to where it hits the ground and just set it to squash, because what's going to happen is it's going to gradually get into that squash shape. Okay? So this is what I typically see, and I want to make sure that you don't do this. Okay, see how it comes up? It's pretty good there. And then it starts getting to the squash shape, and then it hits and does that. Okay? Yes, it is. All right, so what we need to do is go, here's where it hits the ground at, in my case, it's at frame 19. I want to go one frame before it and then stretch it back out again. I have to keep in mind, too, that I can't go like this because I've just gone through my plane. I've gone through the ground. Okay. Also, if I remember my numbers from my first one, 0.7, 1.5, 0.7, I should not have that much of an extreme level. Okay. So if anything, I might be at 0.75, 1.4, 0.75. Okay, then once you're done with that, then you can go to frame 19 and then squash it. So I'm going to bring it in. I'm going to hold the control key, scale this out, and then shift R, go up a frame, shift R. Okay, because we have to have two keyframes right here that are the exact same scale. Okay, you could have probably one that's a little bit lower, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. All right, so once we have the first part of this set up, the rest of it is just going to be repetitive, okay? It's just going to be a matter of, okay, here's my settings for this last stretchiness, 0.75, 1.4. So when I go after this, the frame after this thing starts taking off, I just reset it. I just go here, I just go there, and I believe it was 0.75, so maybe I go to 0.8, 1.3, and again, I'm giving you numbers just because it's easier to kind of remember the numbers instead of trying to figure it out. It's up in the air, so it should be rounded. Come on. It's coming back down. I do the same thing. I'm going to go to the frame before and stretch this out. Do that. Goes flat, so I flatten it out. All right, so now that we have these, there's more work that we can do, as always, to kind of tweak this thing and get it the way we want it to. If we're trying to finesse this thing, I'm looking at just the scales right now. Okay, so I clicked on the graph editor and I highlighted all 3 scales. This right here is my 1. Right down the middle, here my value 1, going straight down here. If I could draw a horizontal line or see a guide, that would be a nice spot to be able to do that. But if you look at how far up these go and how far down these go, it's not really proportionate. You can see that I'm stretching more vertically than I'm going in more, and vice versa. Okay? So if I wanted to, I could always come in here and kind of balance these out. Okay? Especially if you have something where it's not really balanced at all. I'm just going to use this one area. If these are way up here and these are way up there, that's going to give me a really weird looking look to this. If I rewind this, you can see here it is. And I go up. It doesn't look too bad, but it does not look the same as it did before. Okay? But you can always look at these and say, okay, I want to balance this. So you can move these down until you have basically the same spacing on each side if you wanted to. Okay? This is where the artistic side comes in, even though it looks very technical. Same thing here, I could balance these out. Now one thing I do want to make sure of is my extremes in this get less and less. And you can see that that's the case. Here are the extremes for this. Here they're getting less. Here they're getting less. Here, this one's a little bit high, so I can lower that. This one's a little high, I can lower that. But you can see how they're basically getting smaller and smaller, making this appear that that stretchiness is going away. And that's what we're having when we look at this. We can see that we're really stretchy here. And if I go to one of my end shots, you can see there's barely any stretch. Okay, that's what you want. And at some point, it just goes round and rolls off. Now, you noticed it, or a couple people noticed, that we're no longer on the ground. Okay? If I go into my front view, you can see we have a little bit of a gap here. Every stretch is going to be different. So we have to go into our graph editor for the Translate Y. And we have to kind of watch this and say, okay, here we are at the beginning. We're not hitting the ground. So I'm just going to use my keyframe here and just hold down Shift and move it down until it's touching. Now, we also have to make sure that when we go for our stretchiness, that there's a difference. Okay? Sometimes you move this keyframe down, and now your stretchiness is like cutting off into the ground plane. So you just have to be aware of it. And if you do need to add an extra key, you can add an extra key. So same thing here. Here's this, there's in the ground. So I'm going to go to this point, push it down to the ground, and we might see it here. Actually, no, we don't. Look at that, perfect. Okay, and that's good there. Here's our next one. So I just scoot that down. And this is just eyeballing it. And I think that should be good after this one. There we go. All right, so we're going to just do some basic setup here. I'm just going to create a plane, just so we have a plane. And I'm not going to do anything fancy with the lighting or texturing. When you turn your stuff in, you're going to be fully rendering these things out. So if you're not comfortable with lighting or texturing, play with some stuff, okay? So inside of the render settings, which is this clapper with the 2 dots here, it takes us to the Maya Software Render Settings tab. By default, inside here, not by default, well, by default, they have the motion blur set off. Motion blur inside of Maya software rendering is okay. Mental Ray is better, okay? So we're going to use Mental Ray's renderer. So I'm going to go to the render using and choose Mental Ray. If for some reason your Mental Ray isn't loaded, Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager. And then in here you can find Maya 2 MR.
Which render settings are you in? Are you in the viewport?
No, these ones here.
Oh.
So I find Maya 2 MR, I click Loaded, I click Auto Load, and then I should be able to get to Mental Ray from this area. Okay, occasionally mental ray will not be loaded for whatever reason that Maya decides not to load it.
What, wait a minute, where
Can
was
you
that?
reload that again?
Under Window,
Window.
Settings Preferences, Plugin Manager. Okay, and then you just find Maya 2 Mental Ray, Maya 2 MR. It's way on the bottom. Okay, so under the Quality tab, there's a motion blur section. There's two kinds of motion blur. One is called, yes ma'am.
Sorry, keep asking. I'm in preferences. Where is the
So now we're in the render settings here, this one. We're in the Quality tab, because we switched to Mental Ray and we have the Quality tab. And then we have on the bottom motion blur, and there's a no deformation and a full. No deformation means that you're not really distorting the vertices at all. In this case, we are distorting the vertices. No deformation is a bit quicker. Full is a bit longer. So if you're doing like a helicopter propeller spinning, you could do no deformation because it's simple geometry that's moving. If you're doing a character's punch, their skin is deforming a little bit, so there is going to be some deformation there. Okay, so typically, for stuff like this, we're going to go to full because we have that kind of stuff. And then what we want to do is we want to go to a frame where there's lots of motion, like this, and then just do a rendering. Click the little render preview button. I'm going to the render settings. We're not going to use Maya software just because the quality is not as good as Mental Ray's. So we're going to change this from render using Maya software to render using Mental Ray. Under the Quality tab, we're going to go down to Motion Blur and we're going to choose Full because we have some sort of deformation happening to it. It starts at 1 for the steps, and hopefully this won't crash again. This will be a good way for you to see, how do you open something in Maya 2013 that we worked on in 2014. And there we go. Okay. So I'm going to close down the other Maya. Hopefully I grab the right one.
It only renders the first frame.
That's fine. That's all it's going to render. So I'm going to set my project to the D drive here, there. Open this up. Okay, I opened it and nothing happened. I have to make sure I go to the open option box. Tell it to ignore the version, which is the secret to opening up a 2014 and 2013.
Forwards compatible.
Yeah. And still nothing. Not my day.